Every woman who had ever entered Ong Myung's orbit left a little colder than when she arrived. Not because he raised his voice, he never did. Not because he threatened them, he didn't need to. But because the most dangerous man in Seoul, the silent sovereign of the Kong Empire's successor syndicate, the man who controlled 9 shipping routes, 4 underground auction houses, and the loyalty of 300 men who would die before they ever questioned him, had not once in his 32 years on this earth looked at another human being like they mattered. His own lieutenants said his office temperature dropped 2 degrees the moment he walked in. His rivals whispered that he had ordered a competitor's entire building leveled, not over money, not over territory, but because the man had laughed too loudly in a meeting, and the sound had offended him. The story may have been exaggerated. Nobody dared find out. They called him the Prince of Winter. Boardrooms in Gangnam went quiet when his name was mentioned. Men who had faced prison, beatings, and ruin flinched at the sight of his business card. The daughters of rival bosses, poised, educated, dressed in silk and ambition, had been paraded before him at galas, at private dinners, at arranged meetings their fathers spent months engineering. And every single time, Ong Myung would look past them, not through them, past them, like they were furniture, like they were walls, like they were part of a world he had already decided held nothing worth feeling. His secretary once overheard a rival boss say, "The man doesn't have ice in his veins. He's just forgotten that veins are supposed to be warm." She wrote it down, she filed it. She never told him, because that was the rule of Ong Myung's world. You observed, you obeyed, and you did not, under any circumstances, make a sound he hadn't approved. So on the night of the Black Tower merger, a multi-billion-won contract signing that would quietly shift the balance of Seoul's underworld for the next decade, the 43rd floor of the Kong building was a cathedral. Not a cathedral of God, a cathedral of silence. 12 men in tailored suits, the faint hum of the city below. A single document on a mahogany desk, thick as a Bible, stamped celebration deed, waiting for one final signature that would cement an empire. Nobody was supposed to make a sound. Nobody had accounted for Myra Brown. She was 26, from Chicago's South Side. She ran a boutique pastry shop out of a rented kitchen in Itaewon called Brown Sugar & Co., a place that smelled of vanilla bean and rose water and had exactly 11 tables, 8 regulars, and 0 knowledge of the underworld it had just been hired to cater. She was, by every measure, the wrong person in the wrong building on the wrong night. She wore a cream baker's apron dusted with flour she hadn't had time to brush off. Her hair was tucked neatly under a gray-brown head wrap. Her arms were bare and warm-toned, and her eyes, dark brown, wide-set, always slightly too honest, were focused entirely on balancing the 3-tiered strawberry cream masterpiece on its silver tray. White buttercream, pink sugar roses, pearl drop piping she had redone 3 times because the first 2 versions hadn't been right. She had no idea that the man sitting behind that desk had once made a rival disappear for using the wrong fork at a dinner. She had no idea that the polished black marble floor beneath her feet had been treated waxed smooth as a skating rink by someone in this very room who wanted tonight to go very, very wrong. She was 3 steps from the desk when her left foot went out from under her. 1 second, the cake was perfect. The next second, the world tilted. Myra's arms shot forward in a desperate, futile reach, that instinct to save the thing you worked for even when physics has already made its decision and the silver tray spun, and the 3-tiered cake became a projectile, and the most carefully engineered silence in Seoul was shattered by the singular, devastating squelch of pink frosting meeting a billion-won contract. Then nothing. 12 men forgot to breathe. The secretary's hands flew to her mouth, a gesture so fast, so practiced, it almost looked real. The bodyguard near the wall went stiff, his hand halfway to his jacket. And Ong Myung, the Prince of Winter, the man who had not flinched at a gunshot, who had not blinked at a signed death warrant, who had not smiled in 10 years, sat completely still behind his frosting-splattered desk. Cake on his jacket. Cake on his celebration deed. A single pink sugar rose resting on his left cuff like the universe's most absurd joke. Myra Brown looked up from the floor, flour on her cheek, horror in her wide brown eyes, and said the only thing her brain could produce in that moment. I can remake that. And Ong Myung, the man whose heart was built from black ice and boardroom silence, felt something crack loose in his chest that he had no name for and no protocol to handle. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared. And somewhere deep in a place he had sealed off so long ago he'd forgotten it existed, something moved. Before we start, take a second to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment, and it truly, truly means a lot. The cake hit the desk at 11:47 p.m. Later, when people whispered about it, and they would whisper about it for years, in the way that survivors whisper about things that should have killed them, they would disagree on the details. Some said the sound was a slap. Others said it was more of a collapse, a soft, devastating cave-in of sugar and cream. One of the bodyguards, a thick-necked man named Bin, who had watched Ong Myung break 3 men's careers with a single phone call, would later describe it to his wife as the sound of fate rearranging itself. His wife told him he was being dramatic. He never corrected her, because he knew she hadn't been in that room, hadn't felt the specific, suspended horror of those 3 seconds when 43 floors above Seoul, a black woman from Chicago and the most feared man in Asia occupied the same terrible moment. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Myra had arrived at the Kong building at 10:15 p.m., which was 45 minutes earlier than the event coordinator had specified, because Myra Brown was the kind of person who built buffer time into everything. She built it into her commute, into her baking schedule, into conversations she was nervous about. She always arrived early so she could stand in a space, breathe it in, and make peace with it before it could intimidate her. It was one of the quiet systems she had built for herself over 26 years of being the kind of person who felt everything a little too loudly on the inside. The lobby of the Kong Tower had not cooperated with her system. It was all dark marble and indirect lighting, the kind of architecture that doesn't whisper money so much as exhale it. The receptionist had looked at her box well, at her cake box, and then at Myra herself, and then at the flower she hadn't quite managed to brush off her left forearm with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to call security. Myra had smiled. She had shown her contract. She had been escorted to a service elevator that was, if possible, even colder than the lobby, and she had spent those 42 floors talking quietly to the cake in the way bakers sometimes do with their most important work. You're fine. You're perfect. Don't move. The 3-tiered cake did not move. It was a masterpiece. White Italian buttercream, smooth as bone. 3 tiers stepped like a small, perfect palace, draped in hand-piped pearl borders and cascading pink sugar roses that Myra had spent 11 hours constructing petal by petal on her kitchen counter, while Korean late-night radio played softly in the background. She had pressed each rose with the kind of attention she couldn't always give to the rest of her life. In the cake, everything was controllable. Everything was exact. She carried it out of the elevator on its silver tray and walked down the hallway toward the room at the end. And that was when she felt it, the specific, catastrophic wrongness of the floor beneath her left shoe. Not slippery the way a wet floor is slippery. Slippery the way ice is slippery. The way something treated to be slippery is slippery. Her foot went forward and her body went with it, and her arms, God bless them, tried everything. They windmilled. They reached. They lunged forward in the heroic, hopeless gesture of someone who understands they have already lost but refuses to accept it until physics makes the final ruling. The door to the office was open. She crossed the threshold, already falling. The room was huge and dark at the edges, and bright at the center. The way stage lighting works, the way power arranges itself, everything important illuminated, everything else swallowed. 12 men in dark suits. A desk the size of a small country. Documents spread out like a treaty. And behind the desk, still as a painting, Ong Myung. She had been told a name. She had not been told a face. But she knew, the way you always know, which person in a room holds the gravity, He sat like a man who had decided, some years ago, that stillness was a form of control, and had practiced it until it became indistinguishable from nature. Dark suit, perfectly fitted, white shirt, a silk tie so dark it was nearly black. One hand rested flat on the desk, the other had been reaching for the pen. He was, objectively, devastating. The kind of handsome that looks like it cost something. None of which mattered, because the cake was already in the air. It happened in a sequence that her brain would replay for months, always in slow motion, always with that awful suspension of cause preceding consequence. The tray tipped. The cake, her 11-hour cake, her hand-piped roses and pearl borders and 3 stacked tiers of strawberry cream left the tray at an angle. It crossed the desk in a single, elegant arc. And it landed with a sound that was somehow both violent and soft, directly on the document in front of Ong Myung. Frosting spread. A tear crumbled. One perfect pink sugar rose tumbled from the wreckage and came to rest against his left cuff like a small, absurd punctuation mark. Myra hit the floor half a second later. Her knees took the impact. She caught herself on her palms. And then she was still, on the polished marble of the most dangerous office in Seoul, surrounded by the fragments of her best work, staring up at a man she had just caked. The silence that followed was not a regular silence. It was the silence of 12 people who had, in the same instant, run the math and arrived at the same answer. The bodyguard near the wall had gone rigid, one hand at his side, his face a careful mask of a man waiting to receive instructions. 2 of the suited men near the window had exchanged a look that lasted less than a second and contained an entire conversation. And the secretary, she stood to the right of the desk, a clipboard clutched tight to her chest, both hands pressed over her mouth in a gesture of such theatrical horror that, had anyone been paying attention to anything other than the wreckage, they might have noticed it arrived a half-beat too quickly, too prepared, too perfect. Nobody was paying attention to the secretary. Everyone was looking at Myung. He had not moved, not a single muscle. The pen was still between 2 fingers. His eyes had traveled from the ruined document to the ruined cake to the woman on his floor, and they had stopped there, and they had not moved, and his expression, his famously unreadable expression, had done something that none of the 12 people in the room had a reference point for. It had paused. Not anger, not coldness, not the specific, quiet wrath that preceded the kinds of decisions that made headlines nobody was allowed to print. Just pause. Like a man who had encountered something outside his existing categories and was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely uncertain what to do next. Myra looked up at him from the floor, flour on her cheek. Eyes so wide they seemed to be trying to take in more information than eyes are designed for. Her hands were flat on the marble. Her apron was twisted. One of her sugar roses was 3 inches from her left knee. She opened her mouth. Her brain, to its credit, attempted language. "I can remake that," she said. The voice was quiet. Not afraid, or rather, afraid but doing something useful with the fear, routing it through a system of fundamental Myra Brown stubbornness that had kept her upright through worse things than this. Her eyes didn't drop. She didn't crumble. She looked at him with a kind of directness that wasn't confidence so much as a refusal to pretend she was anywhere other than exactly where she was. The 12 men in the room continued to not breathe. Ong Myung looked at her for 3 seconds that felt geological. Then he set the pen down. Nobody moved for a long moment. The bodyguard, Bin, had his hand so close to his jacket that the fabric creased. One of the lawyers near the window had gone the color of old paper. The event coordinator who had commissioned the cake, a thin, meticulous man named Park who was standing in the doorway, had pressed himself so flat against the frame that he was functionally part of the architecture. Myung stood slowly. He was tall in the way that certain men are tall, not just in inches, but in the vertical weight of all the space they occupy. He came around the side of the desk with the unhurried precision of a man who had never once needed to rush toward anything, because everything that mattered eventually waited for him. He stopped in front of the ruined cake. He looked at it the way a surgeon looks at an incision, appraising, thorough, without sentiment. Then he extended one finger and drew it slowly across the edge of the surviving bottom tier, collecting a stripe of white buttercream and a smear of strawberry filling. He raised it to his mouth. He tasted it. The room waited. His expression did not change in any way that could be described with words, but something moved behind his eyes, something fine and small and quickly contained, like a light switched on and off too fast to name the color. He looked down at Myra, still on the floor, still watching him with those two honest eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was low and even, and possessed of that particular quiet that doesn't need volume because it has never needed volume. "Get up," he said. Mayra got up. She stood in front of him, close enough to see that his lashes were unreasonably long for someone so apparently constructed from tungsten, and she waited, because there was nothing else to do. "Your name," he said. "Myra Brown." "Where are you from, Myra Brown?" "Chicago," she said. "South Side." Something registered faintly in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Recalibration. "The frosting," he said. "What is in it?" She blinked. "Of all the things. Vanilla bean paste. A little lemon zest. And I fold in a small amount of cream cheese for texture. It keeps the sweetness from being too flat." He regarded her for another long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his chair with the same measured, deliberate calm, and lowered himself into it, and looked at the ruined document, and the ruined cake, and the lawsuit of a situation spread across his mahogany desk, and said in the same quiet voice, "You owe me 10,000 more bites." Park, the event coordinator, made a sound like a man who had just been informed that his parachute was decorative. 10,000, Myra started. "The contract," Myung said, not looking up, "can be reprinted. The dessert cannot be uneaten." He turned the barest fraction of his attention toward his secretary, who still had both hands over her mouth. "Cancel the signing. Reschedule for Monday." His eyes moved back to Myra. "You will come to my estate tomorrow evening at 11. You will bring your equipment. You will begin repaying your debt." That's not I have a shop to run." "Yes," he said, "you do. And if you would like it to continue running, you will be at the estate at 11. He picked up his phone from the desk and turned his gaze to it, and the conversation, as far as Ong Myung was concerned, was over. The 12 men in the room slowly remembered how to exist. Bin escorted Myra to the elevator without a word, and she rode those 42 floors down with her empty silver tray and her scraped palms and the absolute, ringing bewilderment of a woman who had just survived something she didn't yet have the vocabulary for. In the elevator, she looked at her reflection in the polished doors, flower on her cheek, hair still neat under the head wrap, eyes still a little too wide. 10,000 bites, she thought. She didn't know yet that the floor had been waxed on purpose. She didn't know that the document she had destroyed had contained a hidden clause that would have slowly, legally, surgically dismantled everything Ong Myung had built. She didn't know that the secretary's hands-over-mouth moment had been rehearsed. She didn't know that by dropping that cake, she had entirely by accident saved a man's life. She only knew that she had a standing appointment at the most dangerous address in Seoul, beginning tomorrow at 11 p.m. She pulled out her phone and texted her assistant, "Going to need the commercial mixer. And more roses." The estate was north of the city, set back from a private road behind walls that didn't announce themselves the way security walls usually do. No spikes, no cameras you could see, just stone and height and the specific quiet of a place that had decided it wasn't interested in your opinion of it. A car had been sent, not a driver who made conversation. A driver who appeared at her shop at 10:30, loaded her equipment into the back of a car that smelled of leather and no questions, and delivered her to a side entrance where a woman in a dark uniform checked her bags with the thoroughness of airport security, and then led her to a kitchen. The kitchen stopped her in the doorway. It was enormous. The kind of kitchen that exists in professional restaurants and the fever dreams of pastry chefs. Long marble counters, a battery of ovens, refrigeration that hummed at exactly the right pitch, copper pots hanging like polished planets from ceiling racks. It was also, visibly, barely used. The equipment was immaculate, in the way that things are immaculate when nobody touches them. "He doesn't cook," said the woman in the uniform, reading her expression. "Does he eat?" Myra asked. The woman almost smiled. Almost. "He will tell you what he wants," she said, and left. Myung arrived at 11:08, which Myra catalogued as the first piece of information that didn't fit a man who ran his entire world on precision being 8 minutes late to his own arrangement. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in a different suit from the night before. Still perfect, still dark. He had loosened his collar by one button, which was perhaps the most informal thing about him and felt, given everything, quietly significant. He stood in the doorway and looked at her setup with an expression that gave nothing away. "What are you making?" he said. "Brown butter financiers," Myra said, already mixing. "Small. 2 bites each. The flavor is closer to the buttercream you tasted last night, vanilla, and something underneath it." "I thought that was the part you responded to." He was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that." "I notice things," she said, and didn't look up from the bowl. He didn't respond. He pulled out one of the high stools at the counter's edge and sat and watched her work and said nothing. Myra had half expected interrogation, instructions, the relentless authority of a man accustomed to directing everything in his environment. What she got instead was a quality of attention that was, in its own way, more unnerving. The focused, absolute attention of someone who had decided that you were worth watching and was watching accordingly. She worked. He watched. The kitchen filled with the smell of browning butter, that deep, nutty sweetness that is almost caramel, but not quite. She whisked the batter with the economy of movement that comes from years of doing the same thing until it becomes muscle memory, poured it into the small molds with practiced steadiness, slid them into the oven and set the timer without looking. "You've been doing this a long time," Myung said. It wasn't a question. "Since I was 8, Myra said. "My grandmother's kitchen. She had one of those old tube pans, the kind with the feet, and she let me use it whenever I wanted as long as I cleaned up after myself." Silence. "My grandmother," he said, after a moment, "did not have a kitchen." It was such a simple statement, delivered without inflection, without apparent intent to invite sympathy or connection. Just a fact, laid down on the counter between them, like one of her tools. Myra glanced at him. He was looking at the oven. She thought about several responses and chose the one that felt most honest. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her then. That same recalibrating pause from the night before. Then he returned his attention to the oven, and the kitchen was quiet again, and the financiers baked in the warmth between them. She came back every night for the following week. The arrangement solidified into a rhythm that made no logical sense, and yet felt, from the inside, oddly inevitable. She arrived at 11. She baked. He sat at the counter. Sometimes he asked questions about technique, about ingredients, about the science of why certain things worked. The questions were always precise, always directed, always structured the way his boardroom questions presumably were, as if information were a resource to be acquired rather than a pleasure to be enjoyed. But she noticed that he stayed until whatever she was making came out of the oven. She noticed that he always tasted. She noticed that he was, very slowly, in increments so small they were almost invisible, learning to arrive 8 minutes earlier each night. On the 4th night, he arrived at 10:55. She didn't say anything, but she smiled at her mixing bowl for a second before she could stop herself, and she was fairly certain that he saw it, and she was entirely certain that he filed it somewhere. The flour fight was nobody's fault, technically. Or it was both of their faults equally, which amounted to the same thing. It was the 10th night. Myra was attempting to teach him at his request, delivered with all the casual authority of a man asking for a quarterly report, the difference between folding and stirring. It was, she explained, a matter of respecting the air you'd built into the batter. Stirring killed it. Folding preserved it. The distinction was everything. "Show me," he said. She showed him. He watched. He attempted it. His fold was technically correct and spiritually wrong, the movement of a man applying logic to a process that runs on intuition. "No," she said. "You're thinking too hard." It's more like she reached over and adjusted his grip on the spatula without thinking, her hand over his, and both of them went briefly, completely still. She stepped back. "Like that?" she finished, at a slightly different register. He looked at his hand, and then at her, and then at the batter, and he folded it again. And this time it was right, not because the technique had changed, but because something else had, some small surrender of control that loosened the movement into something almost graceful. "Better," she said. "Don't patronize me," he said. But there was a fraction of something in it that was not his usual flatness. "I'm not," she said. "That was genuinely better. You have good hands." She paused, hearing herself. "For folding, technically." He looked at her. The fraction of something widened, microscopically, and she felt it in her sternum like a low bell tone, and she turned back to the counter and busied herself with absolutely nothing urgent. "Now we sift," she said firmly. The sifter was on the shelf above the counter, and she reached for it at the same moment he apparently decided to be helpful, which was so unprecedented that neither of them had a protocol for the spatial consequences. His arm came over her shoulder to reach the same shelf. She turned to redirect. The bag of flour that had been sitting at the counter's edge caught her elbow, and approximately 2 cups of all-purpose flour became briefly airborne. It landed on both of them. She got the worst of it. The flour settled white across her head wrap and her shoulders and the front of her apron like a light snowfall, but a meaningful amount had also caught Ong Myung across the right side of his face and the lapel of his jacket. And he stood there for a moment in the ringing aftermath. Flour on his cheekbone, flour on his collar, looking like a man who had just been informed that the universe had opinions about him. Myra put one hand over her mouth. She tried. She genuinely tried. The laugh came out anyway. It was not a polite laugh. It was not a covered, apologetic, "I'm so sorry, how unfortunate" laugh. It was a real one, the kind that starts somewhere deep and comes out before you can architect it, bright and sudden. And she laughed at the most powerful man in Seoul standing in his own kitchen with flour on his face, and it was the most alarmed she'd felt in 10 days, and also, helplessly, the funniest thing she had ever seen. She expected ice. She expected the temperature drop. She expected the particular stillness that meant the conversation was over. Instead, Ong Myung looked at her laughing, and something happened to his face. It wasn't a smile. Not entirely. It was the architecture of one, the muscles at the corners of his mouth, making a decision they hadn't made in a long time, testing the motion, getting close. His eyes, which were always controlled and always watchful, did something she hadn't seen them do before. They warmed, just slightly, just barely, like a window with a light behind it. It lasted 3 seconds. Then his phone rang. The warmth closed off as fast as it had opened. His hand went to his inside pocket. He looked at the screen. His face reset into something that had no memory of flour or kitchens or the last 3 seconds, and he turned and walked to the far end of the room. And when he spoke, his voice was the temperature she'd met on the first night. "When?" he said. "Then. How many?" Then, after a silence. "Finish it." He hung up. He stood at the end of the kitchen for a moment with his back to her. Then he turned, and the man who had been almost smiling 30 seconds ago had been replaced completely by the other one, the one who wore the same face but lived in an entirely different world. "I have to go," he said. "Okay," Myra said. "The financiers are in the oven. Set the timer for another 4 minutes. I know how long they need." He looked at her for a moment across the length of the kitchen. The flour was still on his lapel. He hadn't noticed, or hadn't cared, or had decided not to care, which was somehow worse. "Tomorrow at 11, he said. "Tomorrow at 11, she said. He left. The kitchen door closed. Myra stood in the quiet and the warmth and the smell of baking and thought about the 3 seconds of almost smile, and the phone call that had erased it, and the specific way a man sounds when he tells someone to finish it and means something entirely different from what those words mean in a kitchen. She set the timer for 4 minutes. She stayed until the financiers came out, because someone had to. The invitation arrived on a Friday, delivered by Bin personally, who handed it to her at the shop counter with the expression of a man fulfilling a task he had not been given context for and had long since stopped asking for context. It was a cream envelope, thick paper, the kind of stationery that costs more per sheet than most people spend on lunch. Inside, 1 card, 3 lines. Saturday, 8 p.m. The Lotte Tower Ballroom. You are the caterer. Below that, in a different hand, his, she assumed, compact and angular and entirely in control. Wear something appropriate. Myra held the card for a moment and then looked at Bin. What does appropriate mean to him? She asked. Bin's expression remained exactly as it was. There will be a dress waiting at the estate. 5 p.m. He bought me a dress. The stylist selected it. He has stylists who buy dresses for his caterers? Bin appeared to weigh several responses. Saturday, 5 p.m., he said, and left. The dress was red. Not the kind of red that politely suggests itself. The kind of red that has already decided. Floor length, cut clean, structured at the shoulders and falling open at the back in a way that required you to commit to it entirely or not at all. Beside it, laid out with the precision of evidence at a crime scene. Shoes, a small evening bag, and a note that said, "Your equipment will already be there." Myra put on the dress. She stood in front of the estate mirror for a long moment. She looked like the version of herself that she kept mostly theoretical. The Lotte Tower Ballroom on a Saturday evening in Seoul looked like money having a formal disagreement with itself. 300 people in extraordinary clothes, speaking in the particular clipped register of people who discuss billions the way others discuss weather. The catering table was positioned with precision near the room's east wall, white linens, silver stands, her pastries arranged with the elegance she always managed and never took credit for. She stood behind it and watched the room arrive. Myung entered at 8:15. He came in with 2 men she didn't recognize, flanking him at a distance. Not bodyguards exactly, or not only bodyguards. They had the quality of weapons that had been given good manners and expensive suits. The room calibrated itself around him the way rooms do when power enters them without announcing itself. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted, the way a river's current changes when something large moves through it. He wore black. Of course he wore black. White shirt, no tie tonight, another one of those microscopic departures from his usual armor that she'd started cataloging without meaning to. He moved through the room without looking at it, and then he looked at her, and he walked toward the catering table with the directness of a man who has already decided where he's going and would like the room to adjust accordingly. He stopped across the table from her. "The tarts," he said. "Which are they?" "Lemon with an Earl Grey cream," she said. "The dark ones are chocolate with black sesame. I made both because I wasn't sure of the guest profile." He took the lemon tart. He tasted it. Something precise moved behind his eyes. "The cream," he said. "Same method as the financiers. You fold, not stir." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite, but close. "Come," he said, and moved away from the table. "I'm the caterer," she said. "I should stay. The table doesn't need you to stand in front of it," he said, without turning. "Come." She came. What followed was 3 hours that Myra would spend a significant portion of the following week failing to accurately explain to her assistant. Myung moved through the gala, with her beside him, not behind him, not trailing, beside, and he introduced her to no one, which meant no one knew how to file her, which meant the entire room watched her with the specific, agitated curiosity of people accustomed to having a category for everything. She was not a girlfriend, the word was clearly inadequate, and also something about the way he didn't touch her suggested a deliberateness that felt more significant than touching. She was not an assistant. She was not arm candy, though the red dress had opinions about that. She was, manifestly, someone who had been placed beside Eung Myung on purpose, which meant she was someone, and no one in the room knew who. It drove them, she noticed, absolutely insane. The rivals were the easiest to identify. 3 families positioned at different points in the room, and she caught the looks, the assessing, tight-jawed looks of men who had their own equations and were trying to figure out where she fit in them. One man, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, watched her for so long that she finally looked back at him, and he didn't drop his gaze quickly enough, and she filed that away. Myung, for his part, did not explain her. He brought her a glass of sparkling water without being asked. He angled his body during conversations so that she was not at anyone's back. When one of the silver-haired man's associates made a comment in Korean, low and sideways, intended to be private, Myung's expression did not change, but his response came back clipped and final, and the associate did not speak again. Near midnight, they stood at the tall windows overlooking the city, and the Han River was lit below them like a second skyline, everything reflected and doubled, the real city and its shadow version running parallel into the dark. That was deliberate, Myra said, looking at the river. Bringing me out here, making them wonder. You have good eyes, he said. I told you. I notice things. He was quiet for a moment. Beside her, not close, but present in the way that he always was. That quality of density that made him feel larger than his outline. The silver-haired man, she said. Jang family? Myung turned to look at her. He was watching me too hard, she said. Not the way men watch a woman they find attractive. The way they watch a variable they haven't accounted for. You know the Jang name, he said. It was not, quite, a question. I've been baking for elite households in this city for 8 months, she said. I hear things. She paused. In Korean. I understand Korean. The silence that followed was the kind that reconfigures space. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. How long? He said. Since before I opened the shop, she said. I wanted to understand the city I was living in. A beat. I thought you should know, before it becomes relevant some other way. He was quiet for a very long time. The river ran below them. The ballroom moved and glittered behind the glass. How much? He said. Have you heard? Enough, she said, to understand that your table at the east wall is not actually a catering table. He looked at her. And this time, the thing that moved behind his eyes did not close off. It stayed complicated and present, and something she couldn't name but felt like a pressure change, the air before weather. Tomorrow at 11, he said, finally. Tomorrow at 11, she said. They stood at the window until the gala began to thin, the city holding them in its reflection, the ordinary and the extraordinary occupying the same dark water, and for once, neither of them looked away. The leak announced itself the way serious things always do, quietly, and then all at once. It began with a shipment that arrived 4 hours early to a warehouse that no one outside Myung's innermost circle was supposed to know existed. Then, a meeting, private, off-calendar, held in a restaurant Myung had booked under a false name that the Jung family's representatives somehow attended from the building across the street. Cameras aimed at the right window, at the right angle. Then a phone call intercepted. Not Myung's line, but Won Bin's, which meant the breach was not external. It was dressed in a good suit and had a desk in his building. Myung said nothing when the intelligence was laid before him. He read the report once, set it flat on the desk, and sat in the particular quality of silence that his men had learned to distinguish from his regular silence, the one that meant something had been decided and the machinery was already moving. Who has standing access to the scheduling system? He asked. Won Bin listed 4 names. 3 of them Myung dismissed immediately, loyalty tested, loyalty confirmed, years of accumulated trust that held. The 4th name he let sit in the air of the room without commenting on it. The way you might let a suspicious piece of fruit sit on the counter before you decide whether to throw it away. The secretary's name. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. Won Bin understood, and Won Bin nodded once. And that was the beginning of a surveillance operation so precise and so patient That it would take 3 weeks to complete 3 weeks, during which Ong Myung behaved exactly as he always had, gave the secretary exactly the access she expected, and watched. Myra had noticed before he told her anything. That was the thing about being shy, and Myra Brown was, genuinely, shy in the way that some intensely observant people are shy, not from weakness, but from the habit of watching before speaking, of cataloging before concluding. She had spent her whole life in the background of rooms and therefore knew, better than most, what the background looked like when it was performing itself. The secretary performed her horror too well. Had performed it since the night of the cake. That gesture hands to mouth, eyes wide, arriving a half beat too quickly, with too much precision in the placement of the fingers. Myra had filed it. She had a very organized mental filing system. It was one of the reasons her pastry work was so consistent, and also one of the reasons she had, over the past several weeks, been paying attention to every detail of every interaction in Ong Myung's building with the focused patience of a woman who understood that she was somewhere dangerous and that understanding the terrain was the first condition of survival. She noticed the secretary watching her during the gala, not with the performed horror anymore, but with something calculating and cold underneath the professional smile, the kind of assessment that isn't curiosity but inventory. She noticed the secretary handling her delivery boxes on the 3rd week, when Myra arrived at the estate kitchen with a new order of supplies. The woman's hands had moved across the boxes with the brisk efficiency of someone doing a routine check, but Myra had packed those boxes herself, had arranged everything in a specific order as she always did, and when she unpacked them in the kitchen, the order was fractionally different. Not enough for anyone who hadn't packed them to notice. Enough for Myra. She wrote it in her notebook under a column she had begun labeling in a coded shorthand she'd developed at 14, growing up in a building where privacy was a luxury you manufactured yourself. She baked Myung's morning delivery the next day with particular care. The Jang family made their first move on a Tuesday. Myra was in the Itaewon shop, alone. The sign flipped to closed because she had a large order due Thursday and needed the kitchen to herself. She was icing a batch of honey citrus-layered cakes when the door opened. She always locked it when she was working alone, always. This was a rule she had kept for 3 years and understood in the 2 seconds it took her to register that it was open and that the man coming through it was not a customer, that someone had unlocked it from outside. 2 men. Suits that were expensive, but not in the Kong way, flashier, louder, the kind of expensive that announced itself. The one in front had a wide face, and the particular settled patience of a man who did this kind of thing regularly enough that it no longer required effort. "Miss Brown," he said, in Korean, then switched to English with deliberate precision which told her immediately that they had done their homework. "Mr. Jang would like to speak with you." She set down her offset spatula. She calculated the distance to her phone, to the back door, to the knife rack. She calculated all of it in approximately 3 seconds while her face stayed very still. "I don't know any Mr. Jang," she said. "You know Ong Myung?" the man said. "That's enough." They drove her to a building in Mapo, not far from the river, into a room that was too clean to be accidental and too spare to be innocent, the kind of room that had been designed to communicate, through its emptiness, that it could absorb a great deal without leaving evidence. Jang Wookjin was 51, silver-haired, with the smooth, unremarkable face of a man who had cultivated blandness as a professional asset. He sat across from her at a table with 2 glasses of tea he had poured hers first, which was a power move she recognized, and looked at her with something between curiosity and the calm of a man holding a very good hand of cards. "You're brave," he said. "Or you're naive. I haven't decided which." "I've been told both," Myra said. "Neither is accurate." Something flickered in his eyes, not quite respect, but the precursor to it. "You're important to him," Jang said. "We both know this. What I need you to understand is that you are currently in a position that is unnecessarily dangerous. For you." He pushed one of the glasses of tea toward her. "I'm not the threat here, Miss Brown. I'm the offer. Leave Seoul. Leave the shop. The arrangement. All of it. We'll compensate you generously. More than the cake contract was worth. More than whatever debt Myung has convinced you is real. Myra looked at the tea. She did not touch it. And if I don't? Jang's expression didn't change. Then you become a variable in a situation that tends to be unkind to variables. She understood what he was saying. She understood it clearly. The way you understand a thing when someone has been careful enough to never actually say it. She sat with it for a moment, the size of the choice, the shape of the risk, the distance between Chicago and this room and all the small decisions that had led here, the market run at 5 in the morning, the flower cloud, the red dress, then keep baking and felt, with a certainty that surprised her slightly, that she was not afraid. I appreciate the offer, she said. I'm going to stay. Jang studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man filing a new piece of information under a category he hadn't previously needed. Then we understand each other, he said. They drove her back to the shop. She went inside, relocked the door, finished the honey citrus cakes, and then sat down on the kitchen floor for approximately 7 minutes, alone in the vanilla-scented, quiet breathing. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote. She told Myung that night in the kitchen, efficiently and without performance, the way she had learned he preferred information facts first, assessment second, no decoration. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that was not empty but full, pressurized. The silence before a decision rather than after one. You should have called me immediately, he said. I handled it. That's not. I handled it, she said again. Not unkindly, but with the particular calm of a woman who had been handling her own situations for 26 years and found the suggestion that she shouldn't have to slightly patronizing. I'm telling you now. He looked at her. His jaw was tight in a way she had come to recognize as the physical expression of something he was not saying in this case, she suspected, something in the vicinity of fear, though she doubted he would have used that word. You're not leaving, he said. It was not quite a question. No. Another pause. You're not afraid. I'm afraid, she corrected him. I'm just not leaving because of it. He looked at her for a long time with that expression that had no name in his repertoire and no protocol, and then he turned away and said, very quietly, Don't deliver anything this week. Stay out of the shop. Myung, please. The word was so careful, so precise, as if he had retrieved it from somewhere it had been stored for a very long time and was handling it the way you handle something you're not sure is still structurally sound. Please, just this week. She looked at his back and thought about the word please in his voice and what it had cost him and what it meant that he'd paid it. 1 week, she said. She gave him 4 days. On the 5th day, she was in the shop before dawn. She had told herself she was only going to check the oven calibration, only for an hour, only because the Thursday order was behind and she couldn't let a client down because of someone else's power games when the back door opened. This time, she'd locked it. This time, they had a key. 3 men. Faster, less conversational than the previous visit. One of them put her phone on the floor. Another put a bag over the supply shelf she'd been reaching toward. The third looked at her with the efficient blankness of a professional and said, in Korean, come quietly. She came quietly. She was calculating the entire time. Myung knew within 11 minutes. Wonbin called it. The shop's alarm system, which Myung had upgraded quietly, without telling her, 2 weeks after the gala had registered a forced entry and transmitted a location signal on a frequency that went directly to Wonbin's phone. By the time the signal came through, the surveillance operation on the secretary had already, in the past 72 hours, produced everything Myung needed. He was already dressed. He was already cold. Not the cold of the boardroom, not the performed cold that was a management tool, not even the cold that his enemies described the glacial, strategic chill of a man who ran his empire on the calculated suppression of every human impulse that might make him predictable. This was something older and quieter and more absolute. The cold that lives at the center of something that has been pushed past the boundary of its own tolerance. He stood in the middle of his study, and his face was perfectly still and Wonbin, who had been with him for 11 years and had seen things that had rearranged his understanding of human capacity, looked at his employer and felt, for the first time in his professional life, genuinely uncertain which outcome would be more complete. The warehouse? Myung said. Mapo, near the river. Wonbin paused. The secretary's access logs put her in the scheduling system 4 hours ago. She updated your calendar to show you in Busan tonight. She wanted time, Myung said. Yes. How much does the Jang family think they have? They think they have until morning. Myung straightened his cuffs. He picked up his phone. He looked at the last message in the thread, a conversation with Myra from 2 days ago, her response to his instruction to stay out of the shop, a single line that had read, "You know I'm not good at following rules I didn't agree to." He had read it 7 times. He had not responded. He had understood, in that moment, that he was losing control of a situation that had nothing to do with the Jang family and everything to do with the fact that he had allowed someone inside the perimeter he had built his entire life around maintaining, and that the perimeter had not held, and that some part of him, the part that was not ice, the part that had tasted cardamom, shortbread, and watched hands move through a kitchen and felt something crack loose in his chest on a marble floor, had not wanted it to. He put his phone in his pocket. "Bring the car," he said, and called Director Seo. Wonbin hesitated. Director Seo was the financial crimes liaison, not a rescue call. "Already?" he said. "I've been ready for 6 weeks," Myung said. The warehouse was exactly where the signal placed it, a converted cold storage facility 2 blocks from the Han River, the kind of building whose history had been useful enough to multiple parties over the years that nobody had ever gotten around to tearing it down. 3 guards outside, more inside. Jang Wook-jin's second in command, a man named Dae-sung, who had the misfortune of being both competent and loyal to the wrong family. Myung arrived alone. This was, from a tactical standpoint, an unusual choice. It was also a deliberate one. Lone arrival communicated either desperation or absolute confidence, and everyone in Seoul who had ever sat across a table from Ong Myung knew which one was not in his vocabulary. He walked through the entrance with his hands in his pockets, and the particular quality of stillness that made armed men step back without quite deciding to, and he was brought to the room where Myra was being held unharmed, seated, her notebook open on her knee because she had apparently spent the past hour writing with the smooth, unhurried inevitability of a man arriving somewhere he had always intended to go. Jang Wook-jin was there. Of course he was there. Myra looked up when Myung walked in. Their eyes met. She closed the notebook. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds with an expression that communicated, in that compressed and private language they had built across midnight kitchens and flower clouds and gala evenings, everything he did not say in rooms where people were watching. Then he looked at Jang. "You wanted a meeting," he said. "We're meeting." Jang smiled with the pleasure of a man who believed he had correctly anticipated every variable. "I want your Incheon territories, the northern shipping routes, and the pier access agreements. I know what you want," Myung said. "You've wanted it for 3 years. You tried to get it through the celebration deed. There was a clause on page 47, buried in the territory annexure, that would have transferred operational control under the guise of a joint venture agreement." He paused. "The cake saved me from signing it." Jang's smile lost approximately 5% of its confidence. "You know what I find interesting?" Myung said, in the tone of a man who finds nothing interesting because everything has already been solved. He reached into his jacket and removed a small device matte black, the size of a matchbook, and set it on the table between them. "For the past 6 weeks, Miss, Brown has been delivering pastries to 11 households in Seoul. 8 of those households have members of the Jang Syndicate's financial council. The pastry boxes had a lining ceramic composite, undetectable by standard sweep, very good acoustic range. He set a second device beside the first. 3 of your council members have been discussing the Jang family's offshore account structure in considerable detail. One of them is also discussing it with the Lee family, which I suspect you did not know." He set his phone on the table. The screen showed a financial document, account numbers, transfer records, the specific architecture of how the Jiang family had been moving money for years. Director Seo received the complete file 17 minutes ago, Myung said. The freeze orders are already processing. By morning, every account in that document will be inaccessible. The Jiang family's liquid capital, the operational funds, the emergency reserves, the offshore layering will be gone. He looked at Jiang with the flat, total calm of a man delivering a weather forecast. You came here tonight with leverage. You no longer have it. The room was very quiet. Myra looked at the matchbook-sized devices and thought about her pastry boxes and the careful way Myung's supply deliveries had always been pre-packed, and thought about 11 households, and thought about her notebook, the morning deliveries, the routes she'd taken, the way he'd always known, without her telling him which households had received which orders. She thought, he trusted me with this without telling me. She thought, he kept me safe by making me useful without making me a target. She thought, with a precision that surprised her, that she was going to have a significant number of things to say to him about the ethics of this later. But she was also, undeniably, very glad to be alive. The Jiang family's assets froze at 4:47 inches the morning. By 6 a.m., 3 council members had retained lawyers. By 8 a.m., 2 of them were negotiating with the Financial Crimes Unit with the breathless efficiency of men who had just discovered that loyalty is heavily dependent on the liquidity of its benefactor. By noon, the information they provided had produced 4 additional arrest warrants, dissolved 2 shell companies, and unraveled a peer access fraud that had been running for 6 years. The Jiang Syndicate, which had operated for 2 decades as one of Seoul's most durable criminal institutions, did not survive the week. Not because of violence, there was very little violence, which was, in its own way, the most terrifying thing about it. It unraveled the way financial architecture unravels. Quietly, catastrophically, and with the bleak finality of numbers that simply no longer add up. The secretary was arrested at her apartment on Wednesday morning. She had packed a bag. She had not packed it quickly enough. Ong Myung sent her one message after her arrest, through his legal team. The message was 3 words. I know why. She had been working for the Jiang family for 4 years, feeding information, waiting for the specific moment when proximity to power could become a lever. She had waxed the floor hoping the diplomatic incident of a dead foreign national would unseat him. Instead, the floor had produced Myra Brown, and the cake, and everything that followed. The thing about the best-laid plans, Myung thought, reading the arrest report in his office with the Seoul morning coming through the window, is that they depend on knowing which variables matter. The secretary had calculated everything correctly except the one she'd created herself. He set the report down. He thought about a flower cloud, about a cardamom shortbread, about the corner of his mouth and the word please, and a woman on his kitchen floor who had said, I can remake that with frosting on her hands, and the absolute, undefeated certainty of someone who had never once in her life accepted that broken things were permanently broken. He got his coat. He went to Itaewon. The shop had been trashed in the way that deliberate destruction always looks not random, but purposeful, the specific targeting of things that mattered. The display case was cracked. 2 of the prep tables had been overturned. The flour was everywhere, not from an accident this time, but from intent. Bags torn open and scattered. The sign above the door, Brown Sugar & Co., hand-lettered in her particular confident cursive, had been pulled down and left on the floor. Myra was there. She was sitting on the counter in the back kitchen with a cup of coffee she had made on the 1-cup machine that had apparently survived untouched because it was bolted to the wall, and she was looking at the flour on the floor with an expression that was tired and sad and, underneath both of those things, already planning. She looked up when he came in. He stood in the doorway of her ruined shop with his coat and his perfectly pressed suit and the city morning behind him, and he looked at the damage, at what had been done to the thing she had built, and something moved across his face that wasn't the boardroom calm, and wasn't the near smile from the kitchen, and wasn't any expression she had seen on him before. It was quieter than all of them, more undefended. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Is it over? Yes. Completely? The Zhang family is finished. A pause. The secretary is in custody. Myra nodded slowly, processing this. She looked back at the flower on the floor. The display case is cracked, she said, but the structure is okay. The prep tables just need to be righted. The sign, she stopped, looked at the sign on the floor. Something crossed her face just briefly. The shadow of how much this place meant. The 5 years of early mornings, and bad months and good months, and the smell of vanilla and rose water that had been here even before she had bins, and then she straightened. The sign I can redo. He crossed the kitchen and picked up the sign from the floor. He held it for a moment, reading the letters, and then he set it carefully on the counter beside her, as if it were fragile, which it wasn't, but which felt like the right way to handle it. I'll have a crew here by this afternoon, he said. Full restoration, whatever you need. She looked at the sign beside her, then at him. Myung, she said, quietly. The devices, in the pastry boxes. He held her gaze. He did not offer an excuse. Yes. You could have told me. It would have changed how you moved, how you acted in the households. I needed it to be natural. He paused. He stopped. Something worked in his jaw. I didn't want you to carry that. The knowing. That's not your choice to make for me. No, he said. It's not. And the simplicity of it, the absence of justification, the clean acknowledgement was the thing she had not expected, and it landed in her chest with a weight that wasn't anger but something more complicated and, she thought, ultimately survivable. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the ruined shop. She thought about Zhang's room, and the 2 glasses of tea and the word variable, and how she had sat on this floor for 7 minutes and been afraid and stayed anyway. Not for Myung, not entirely for herself, for the choice she'd made on a Chicago sidewalk when she'd decided to bring her flour and her rose water and her 5 in the morning market runs to a city that wasn't hers and make something real in it. Help me write the tables, she said. He took off his jacket. He folded it over the counter with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who understood that some things required you to put down what you were carrying. He righted the tables. 6 months later, the lobby of the Kong building had a bakery in it. Brown Sugar & Co., Kong Tower, hand-lettered in the same confident cursive, anchored in a ground floor space that got the morning light and smelled. By 7 a.m., every day, of brown butter and vanilla and whatever Myra was testing that week, a new orange blossom tart, a miso caramel financier, a black sesame layered cake that had become, within 3 weeks of its introduction, the thing people made reservations to try. She still had the Itaewon shop. She would always have the Itaewon shop, but she had also said yes to the lobby, not because he had asked her, though he had asked her carefully, with none of the summons and all of the question, but because it was a good space and the light was right, and she had decided, in the months since the warehouse and the ruined kitchen and the righted tables, that saying yes to good things was not the same as losing yourself to them. It was a Saturday morning in March when it happened. Myra was in the Itaewon kitchen, handling the week's custom orders, when her phone lit up with a message from a number in her contacts listed simply as M. The message was, I am in the kitchen, at the estate. She stared at it. A second message. There is flour on the ceiling. She left her apron on the hook and drove to the estate with the particular urgency of someone who suspects both that something is fine and that fine might be, in this specific instance, a relative term. The kitchen looked like a snow globe. Flour had achieved coverage across the counter. The range, the island, a significant portion of the window, and yes, a constellation of white specks across the ceiling that she would later be unable to fully explain from a physics standpoint. The bowl on the counter contained something that had aspired to be cake batter and had produced instead a thick, lumpen, concerningly gray mixture that smelled vaguely of too much baking soda. Ong Myung stood in the center of it. He was in a white shirt, formerly white, currently wearing the evidence of its adventure with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and flour on both forearms and across one cheekbone, an echo of a different kitchen and a different cloud of flour, and the ghost of a near smile. Except that right now, his expression was not a near smile. It was not any of the expressions she had mapped and catalogued and learned to read across midnight kitchens and boardroom doorways and gala evenings and warehouse rooms. It was something she had never seen on his face before. He was looking at the bowl with the focused, slightly horrified attention of a man confronting the specific humility of discovering that competence is domain-specific, that 32 years of absolute control over everything within his considerable reach had not, in fact, prepared him for the interior of an egg. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. "It's your birthday," he said, as if this explained everything, which it did, and also did not. "It's my birthday," she agreed. "I was making a cake." She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the gray batter. She looked at his flour-covered shirt and the sheepish, unguarded, completely unarmored expression on the face of the most dangerous man in Seoul, who had dismantled a crime syndicate with pastry boxes and bought her a lobby and picked up her sign from the floor and folded his jacket over the counter, and who had apparently decided that the appropriate response to her 27th birthday was to attempt, alone, the thing she had been doing every night for months in his kitchen as if watching it 100 times was the same as knowing how it worked. The sound started somewhere in her chest. She tried to hold it. She was not entirely successful. She laughed, not politely, not quietly, but genuinely and fully, the kind of laugh that has been waiting for the right moment and arrives with everything it has been saving up, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, warm and real and entirely at home in the flour-covered space, and she covered her mouth with her hand, but it didn't help, because the gray batter was so gray and the ceiling was so thoroughly dusted and his face was so human in a way that she had been working toward for 6 months without knowing whether she would ever quite get there. And then she heard it. Ong Myung laughed. Not the near smile, not the 1-degree deepening, not the private contained thing in the corner of his mouth that only she could see. A real laugh, low, surprised, slightly rusty with disuse, the sound of a mechanism that hadn't been used in so long it needed a moment to find its range rising up from the chest of a man who had spent a decade building walls around the exact capacity he was now unexpectedly rediscovering in a flour-covered kitchen on a Saturday morning in March. He laughed at himself. At the ceiling. At the gray batter and the broken recipe and the complete, irreversible failure of the project he had undertaken with such careful, private intention. He laughed, and the sound of it mixed with hers, and the kitchen held both of them flour on everything. The smell of too much baking soda and the good underneath it, the winter light coming through the window onto the mess they had made of the counter, and Myra thought about the first night she had walked into this kitchen with her knife roll and her own vanilla extract, and her careful composure, and how she had told the most dangerous man in Seoul that he could sit if he was going to watch. And he had. She crossed the kitchen and looked at the batter. "Okay," she said, still smiling, her voice warm and steady and entirely at home. "We can fix this. It's gray," he said. "I know. Cake is not supposed to be gray." "Correct. I used the right measurements," he said, with the residual dignity of a man accustomed to being right, which made her smile again. "How many eggs did you use?" A pause. 4, he said. "The recipe calls for 2. Another pause. Longer this time." She bit the inside of her cheek. She reached past him, past his flour-covered sleeve, past the arm that had once rested on a mahogany desk next to a ruined contract and a sugar rose, and picked up a clean bowl from the rack, and she started again, the way she always started again, with her hands and her attention and the complete, undefeated certainty that broken things were not permanently broken. He stood beside her and watched, and for once he wasn't watching the way he used to from a distance, from behind the glass of his own carefully maintained separateness, but close, present, with the particular quality of attention of a man who was finally, slowly, learning how to be in a room without governing it. Occasionally he asked questions. Occasionally she answered them. The new batter was smooth and pale and smelled right. And when she slid it into the oven, she set the timer and turned to find him leaning against the counter with flowers still on his cheek and his laugh still faintly present in the set of his expression, not gone, not stored back away, remaining like something that had finally been let out and discovered it didn't want to go back. "You could have just asked me to make a cake," she said. "I know, but you wanted to do it yourself." "Yes." She looked at him. "Why?" He looked at the oven, at the bowl in his hands, which he was turning over slowly with the concentrated attention of a man thinking through something he hasn't quite put into language yet. And then he looked at her with an expression that was open in a way that his face had not been perhaps ever, perhaps for a very long time, and he said, simply and without any of the architecture of coldness that he had spent years constructing around the simple act of meaning something, "Because you deserve something that was made for you. By someone who—" He stopped, looked at the bowl. "By someone who is trying." Myra looked at him for a long moment in the flower-covered kitchen with the cake in the oven and the Saturday morning light on everything and the city going about its business 43 floors below another window in another life. And she felt something settle in her chest with the particular quiet of a thing that has arrived, finally, exactly where it intended to go. She took the bowl from his hands and set it in the sink. She looked up at the flower on the ceiling. "You know you have to clean that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not helping." "I know," he said again, and the corner of his mouth moved, and this time it kept going the full shape of it, unhidden, real, the smile of a man who had remembered, at 32, in a flower-covered kitchen on a Saturday in March, that the world contained things worth feeling. The timer ticked. The cake rose. The ceiling stayed white. And the Prince of Winter, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, longer, perhaps, than he could remember, felt completely, entirely, irreversibly peaceful.